Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a shortcut to understanding a really interesting piece of gear. Often overlooked, actually.
But pretty influential. The BLSS HF2 high-band flanger came out in 85, I think. That's right, 1985. And it really makes you rethink what a flanger even is.
Exactly. Because when you hear flanger...
You think jet engine, right? That massive whooshing sweep.
Totally. But the HF2, right out of the gate, it was, well, different. More refined somehow.
A complete departure, yeah. Especially from its older sibling, the BF2, which was all about that full spectrum intensity.
So that's the puzzle we're kind of unpacking today, isn't it? Why did BLSS deliberately make an analog flanger that just left the low end alone?
That's the core question, and it's key to understanding its genius, really. It wasn't aiming for that jet sound.
No, it sounds like it was aiming for something more.
Oh.
Hi-fi, more transparent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sophistication over sheer power.
Okay, so let's dig right into that, the high band difference. What's actually going on when you only modulate the higher frequencies? Why was that such a big deal?
Well, first, you got to think about how a traditional flanger works. You know, that classic swoosh?
Yeah.
That comes from modulating the delay time across the entire frequency range, the whole signal.
Okay.
And when that delayed signal mixes back with the dry original signal, well, the waves interfere, you get cancellations.
Ah, the comb filtering effect. That's what gives it the sound, the notches.
Yeah.
Precisely. That's the characteristic sound. But here's the rub. When you modulate everything, especially down in the bass frequencies, those phase cancellations, those points where the waves destructively interfere, they can really mess with your low end.
Right, makes sense. Things can get thin or muddy, lose definition.
Exactly. Your chords might suddenly sound weak or the rhythm just gets lost. The HF2 gets around that by focusing the sweep only on the upper harmonics.
So it's like intentional subtraction. You preserve the bass foundation, keep that solid, and only the higher stuff gets that kind of shimmery modulated movement.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So what does that actually sound like compared to, say, the BF2's big sweep? Well, the result is much smoother, brighter, definitely. And really airy is a good word for it.
Okay, airy.
Instead of that deep resonant filter sound that feels like it's kind of swallowing your tone, you get this really nice, almost glassy shimmer. It's just lighter, way less metallic, and much more transparent, really.
And that clarity in the low end, that's the main benefit then.
That's the key. It means you can actually use the effect in a dense mix without its fighting everything else for space. It just fits better.
Which makes it super useful for like studio work or situations where you want motion, but you don't want it to dominate.
Exactly. Motion without the mud, as you said.
Okay, so that takes us neatly under the hood.
Yeah.
If that airy shimmer is the sound, how did they actually achieve that? How did they get an analog circuit to be so frequency specific?
Right. Well, it all starts with the basic architecture. It's a purely analog pedal.
Okay.
And it relies on what's called a BBD, a bucket brigade device circuit.
Right, the BBD. For listeners maybe not super familiar with vintage modulation, what exactly is a bucket brigade device?
Okay. Think of it like an analog delay line, like passing buckets of water down a chain.
Gotcha.
The audio signal, represented as electric charge, it gets passed along a line of tiny capacitors. Those are the buckets.
Okay.
And the speed it gets passed along is set by a clock driver chip. In the HF2, that's the MN3102 clock driver, working with the MN3207 BBD chip itself.
And the speed of that clock determines the delay time.
Yep. And then you have an LFO, a low-frequency oscillator that constantly messes with that clock speed, changing the delay time up and down. That's what creates the modulation effect.
The swoosh.
Right. Or in this case, the shimmer. It's the essential bit of hardware for getting that warm, rich, classic analog sound.
Okay, so the BBD gives us the analog character, the warmth. And the LFO provides the movement, the modulation. But the crucial part for the HF2, how did they make sure that LFO was only hitting the high frequencies before it even gets to the BBD?
Ah, that's the clever bit. That's the secret sauce, really.
Yeah.
They put a dedicated high-pass filter right inside the feedback path of the circuit.
Inside the feedback path. Okay, I'm trying to picture that.
Yeah.
Does that mean the clean low end kind of runs alongside the modulated highs and then they join back up later?
Essentially, yes. The low frequencies either bypass the most intense part of the modulation loop, or maybe more accurately, they get filtered out of the signal that gets fed back into the circuit to create the flanging effect. So only the high frequencies are allowed to circulate through that feedback loop. The high-pass filter makes sure those lower frequencies, the ones that can cause muddy cancellations, don't get amplified and sent back through.
So that's why it keeps its clarity. The low end isn't getting repeatedly phase canceled in the feedback loop.
Precisely. It preserves the integrity. The design goal was really about utility, about being musically useful.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's talk controls then. You've got 4 knobs: manual, depth, rate, and resonance, or res. If the high-pass filter is doing the frequency selection, how do these knobs let you shape that high-end shimmer? Right, they give you control over how that BBD and LFO are interacting, specifically with those filtered highs. So manual basically sets the center point for the delay time.
Sort of the baseline frequency range where the effect sits.
Yeah, where the sweep starts, it's midpoint, you could say.
Yeah.
The rate is pretty straightforward. That's the speed of the LFO, how fast it sweeps.
Right, a fast or slow shimmer.
Mm-hmm. And then you have depth and resonance. People sometimes get these confused on modulation pedals.
Yeah, how are they different here, especially with this high band thing?
Okay, so depth controls how wide the sweep is, how far the LFO pushes the delay time away from that center point you set with the manual knob.
So a wider or narrower shimmer effect. Exactly. It's the breadth of the motion.
Mm-hmm.
But resonance, or res, that's different. It controls how much of that filtered, modulated, high-frequency signal gets fed back into the circuit again.
So it's feedback specifically for the highs.
Right. So when you crank up the res, you're really emphasizing the intensity of those high-frequency phase cancellations. That's what gives it that more pronounced kind of crystalline, sharp edge.
But without making the low end flabby or weird, because that's not being fed back.
Precisely. You get that dramatic high-end texture, but the foundation stays solid.
Okay, I get it. Depth is the width of the wave. Resonance is like the sharpness or peakiness of that high-frequency wave, that clarity.
Yeah, I can see why it's a bit of a sleeper classic.
It really is. It operates in that zone of detailed, subtle control.
So thinking practically, for the listener wondering, okay, where would I use this thing? What are the ideal spots for the HF2? Where does it really shine? Well, its sweet spot is definitely clean rhythm tones, or like atmospheric textures where you want some movement, but subtle movement. Because it doesn't muddy the low end, it's fantastic for complex chords. You know, jazz voicings, add 9 chords, stuff like that, where you really need to hear all the notes clearly.
Yeah, you can't afford to lose the root or the third in a wash of flange.
Exactly. It adds that depth, that little bit of motion, without the heavy, overpowering swirl you get from a traditional flanger.
And you mentioned pairings earlier. Does its kind of polite nature make it play well with dirt pedals?
Oh, absolutely. Because the flanging effect is focused up high, it actually works really well after overdrive or even a preamp.
After. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, you add this controlled, shimmery, high-end motion to a signal that's already got some grit, but you don't dissolve the punch or the core character of the distortion.
That makes sense. A lot of full-range flangers placed after dirt can sound, well, pretty messy. They emphasize the wrong frequencies, maybe.
Totally. They can just amplify noise or create this phasey mess. The HF2 is adding something more delicate on top.
And you also mentioned pairing it with chorus.
Yeah, that's a great combo for really wide, expansive stereo modulation sounds. You can let the chorus handle the broad detuning and warmth. And then the HF2 adds that focused upper harmonic sparkle and movement. They layer really nicely because they're not fighting for the same sonic space.
Unlike trying to stack, say, 2 full-range flangers or phasers, which can just turn into chaos.
Right. It can get very chaotic very quickly.
But we should be clear, there's a trade-off, right? This isn't the pedal if you want that huge dramatic effect.
Definitely not.
If someone's chasing that classic Van Halen jet plane taking off sound, this isn't it.
No, absolutely not. It's built for sophistication, for subtlety, not for brute force drama. You're essentially trading that deep, heavy resonance for clarity and the ability to blend it into a mix really well. The HF2's magic is almost as much about what you don't hear, that lack of low-end mud.
Okay, stepping back to the bigger picture, where does this pedal fit in the BOSS timeline? Production was 85 to 95, you said.
Yeah.
A full decade.
Yep. 10 years, which actually places it in a really interesting transitional time for effects pedals.
That's well.
Well, the mid to late 80s was when high-quality digital rack effects really started taking over, especially in studios. Think stereo delays, pristine digital choruses, effects known for their hi-fi clarity.
Right, the era of big racks and super clean sound.
Exactly. And players, particularly studio guys, were starting to move away from some of the older, sometimes noisier, full-range analog pedals. They wanted sounds that sat better in those increasingly dense studio mixes.
So was the HF2 almost like an analog response to that trend, offering clarity but with analog warmth?
I think that's a great way to put it, yeah. It was kind of BOSS saying, look, we can give you that studio-friendly clarity and subtlety, that refined modulation, but we can do it while keeping the warmth and the character of an analog BBD circuit.
Interesting. So it didn't quite get the legendary status of the BF2, maybe. Not in the same way, no. The BF2 was the ubiquitous workhorse. But the HF2 became really well-loved by a specific group: studio musicians, session players, people who valued transparency above all else.
Exactly. People who needed an effect that could blend in, add texture without screaming, I'm an effect. Its understated nature really did kind of prefigure that cleaner, slicker sound that became big in the late 80s and early 90s studio scene.
So it found its niche with the pros who needed subtlety.
And that's why it's held on to this sleeper classic status. People who know.
Okay, now for the practical bit. If someone is listening and thinking, okay, I want one, we have to talk about power. Vintage pedals, especially BSS from this era, can be a bit tricky, right?
Ah, yes. The inevitable power supply conversation. This is a really crucial point for the HF2, especially the earlier ones.
Good, what to do?
They need 9 volts, either from a battery or an adapter. But the key is, the early ones were designed for the BOSS ACA adapter standard.
ACA. Right, not the PSA standard that most modern BOSS pedals use. What's the difference?
Okay, so the ACA standard was an older, unregulated power supply. It actually put out closer to 12 volts, not 9.
12 volts, but it's a 9-volt pedal.
Well, the pedal had circuitry inside it that was designed to expect that higher voltage and then drop it down to the correct 9 volts once the pedal was drawing power under load.
Okay, so what happens if I plug my shiny, new, modern, standard 9-volt regulated power supply, the kind everyone uses now, into an old ACA spec HF2?
Bad things, or rather suboptimal things, because your modern supply is strictly regulated to deliver exactly 9 volts.
Yeah.
The pedal's internal voltage dropping circuit doesn't receive the higher voltage it expects, so the actual voltage reaching the audio circuit might only be like 6 or 7 volts, maybe even less.
And what does that do to the sound?
It means the pedal isn't operating correctly. You often get lower headroom, maybe the LED light looks dim or inconsistent. And crucially, you can get noticeable clock noise bleeding through from the BBD circuit, which completely ruins the whole hi-fi, clean shimmer thing you bought the pedal for in the first place.
Right, so you end up with a noisy pedal when the whole point was clarity. So what's the solution for someone buying one today?
You basically have 3 options. Find an original BOS ACA adapter, which can be tricky and expensive.
Okay.
Use a modern power supply that has specific outputs designed to replicate the ACA's 12V unregulated output. Some high-end power bricks have this.
Right.
Or the most common solution is to either modify the pedal internally to bypass the voltage dropping part, which isn't too hard if you know how to solder, or use it in a daisy chain with a modern PSA pedal, which sometimes circumvents the issue.
The daisy chain trick.
Yeah, but modification or using the right power supply output is the most reliable way. It's just something you absolutely need to be aware of if you buy a vintage one.
Definitely critical detail. It's the price you pay for that vintage analog elegance, I suppose, to feed it right.
Exactly. You need to do that to unlock its true, quiet performance potential.
Okay, so let's try and bring all this together. We started off saying the BF2, the classic BOS flanger, gave us that raw, metallic, full-frequency resonance.
The jet plane.
The HF2, coming later, was all about intentional analog, sophistication, refinement.
Sophistication is a great word for it. It really redefined what a flanger could be by focusing so carefully on what it excluded that potentially muddy low end.
It delivered that studio-grade shimmer, as you put it.
Yeah, it's a testament to really elegant analog design, achieving that clarity and depth specifically by preserving the frequencies that traditional flangers often mess up.
So it really stands out because of what it chose not to do. And that's why tone purists, people really listening for detail, still value it today for that specific, focused upper harmonic shimmer.
Absolutely. And, it raises kind of an interesting question maybe for you, the listener, to think about. Yeah. Well, if the usual goal for a lot of guitar effects, especially modulation, is to kind of completely take over or dramatically reshape the original dry signal.
Right, to be really noticeable.
What does it tell us that the HF2's lasting success, its whole appeal, actually comes from what it specifically leaves untouched? That preserved low-end integrity. And how does that decision, that careful act of subtraction, maybe change how we think about what elegance really means when it comes to designing analog effects pedals?
That's a great thought. Focusing on what's not there as much as what is.
Exactly. Something to ponder next time you hear a really subtle, really musical modulation effect.